The curse snapped like a whip across the ballroom, and every vampire in the room turned to stare at the maid holding the broken obsidian vial. Celeste Winterbourne did not flinch. She stood in the center of Dragomir Manor's grand hall, wearing a servant's uniform stained with ash and old library dust, her dark hair escaping its pins in wild directions, her grey eyes burning with something that had no business existing in a woman who mopped marble floors for a living. Around her, 30 of the oldest vampires in the Eastern Court had gone utterly, dangerously still. Their white skin glowed like moonstone under the chandelier's cold light. Their silver eyes were fixed on her, with expressions ranging from fury to disbelief, to something that looked almost like fear. Lord Vesperin Call, the High Chancellor of the Eastern Court, took one slow step forward. His white hair swept the collar of his black coat. His voice, when it came, was soft in the way that avalanches are soft before they bury you. "What have you done, little maid?" Celeste looked down at the broken vial in her palm. The obsidian glass had shattered in a perfect spiral, exactly as the text in the Forbidden Archive had predicted it would when the binding seal was released. A thin ribbon of silver smoke rose from the shards and drifted toward the ceiling, like something finally exhaling after a very long time. "I broke it," she said, and her voice was steady. "The curse binding your duke. I broke it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. And then, from the far end of the hall, behind the iron doors that had been sealed for 3 years, came the sound of chains dissolving. The doors opened. Hadrian Dragomir walked through. He was everything the stories had failed to capture. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black shirt and dark trousers that somehow looked like armor on him. His white hair was loose around his shoulders, and his pale skin carried the faint luminescence of an ancient bloodline. His silver eyes, sharp as cut glass, swept the room with the kind of controlled fury that made lesser beings step backward without understanding why. He was the most dangerous thing in a room full of dangerous things, and he moved like he had always known it. His gaze found Celeste immediately. For a moment, the Duke of the Eastern Reaches, the most feared vampire lord in the Northern Hemisphere, stood completely still and simply looked at the human woman holding the broken pieces of the curse that had imprisoned him for 3 years. "You," he said, and the word carried the weight of something enormous. "Me," Celeste agreed. Lord Vesperin moved so fast he was nearly invisible. One moment he was 20 feet away. The next, his hand was closing around Celeste's wrist, the broken vial nearly spilling from her palm. "Seize her," he said to the guards. "The blood law regarding interference in court sentencing is very clear. She has committed an act of forbidden." Hadrian's hand closed around Vesperin's wrist in turn. The entire room held its breath. "Take your hand off her," Hadrian Dragomir said, "and I will only break your wrist." Vesperin released Celeste instantly, and in that single moment, with the curse shattered on the ballroom floor and 30 vampires watching in stunned silence, Celeste finally allowed herself to breathe. She had spent 3 years getting to this room. 3 years learning every secret these walls held. 3 years doubted, dismissed, and ignored by every single person in this building. She supposed it had worked in her favor. Nobody watches the maid. She had been hired 8 months after Hadrian Dragomir was bound. She had not planned it that way. She had applied to work at Dragomir Manor because she needed a job. Because she was 23 years old and the rent on her flat in the city below the manor was 3 weeks overdue, and because the posting on the domestic staffing board offered competitive pay with no questions asked. She had not known, when she pressed the buzzer at the service entrance, that she was walking into the center of a vampire court political catastrophe. She found out quickly enough. The manor sat above the city of Ashford, like a crown nobody was supposed to see. From the street, it looked like a private hotel, all Gothic stone and wrought iron gates. But below it, carved into the bedrock of the hill it sat upon, was the Eastern Court's true seat of power, chambers that had existed for 400 years, archives that held blood law scrolls older than most countries, council rooms where the politics of the vampire world were decided in careful, lethal whispers. Celeste had been assigned to the upper floors, dusting and polishing and changing linens and keeping her eyes down and her opinions to herself. Standard instructions for staff at any of the court-adjacent properties. She had kept her eyes down. She had just also been reading everything she could get her hands on. It had started by accident, truly. She had been carrying fresh linens to a guest room on the east wing's third floor when she had passed an open door she had never seen open before. Inside, she had glimpsed shelves, hundreds of shelves, stacked floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. The archive. She had stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds before moving on, but she had come back that night. The archive was not locked. It had never needed to be. No human servant had ever shown interest in ancient vampire blood law text before, apparently. The ward on the door was keyed to prevent entry by vampires below a certain rank, but it had no protection against a curious human woman with insomnia and a degree in historical linguistics that she had never quite found a use for. She had found Hadrian Dragomir's name in the third scroll she opened. The Duke of the Eastern Reaches, bound under the call sentence dated 3 years prior. The binding seal crafted from obsidian-encased corrupted blood, designed to imprison the subject's full power and agency indefinitely, sustainable only by continuous renewal of the original caster's intent. The caster on the scroll, Lord Vesperin Call. She had read it twice to make sure she had understood correctly. Then she had gone back to her room, lain awake until 4 in the morning, and thought about what a person was supposed to do when they discovered that the master of the house they worked in had been imprisoned illegally by his own court chancellor. She had decided that the right thing to do was find out everything. Over the following months, she had built a picture. It came together slowly, in pieces, fragments from the archive. Over had heard conversations between vampire staff who never thought the human maid mopping the corridor could understand their old dialect. The odd kindness of Mira, one of the lower-ranked vampires on staff who had served under Hadrian before the binding, and who cried in the linen closet on the anniversary of his imprisonment, and did not know Celeste had heard her. Hadrian Dragomir had been bound because he had refused to sign the Eastern Court's expansion treaty. The treaty would have given Lord Vesperin Call access to territories that Hadrian held in trust for smaller, independent vampire communities. Communities that had sworn loyalty to the Dragomir line for centuries and depended on that protection. Hadrian had looked at the treaty, understood exactly what it would do to those communities, and refused to sign. Vesperin had called it treason. The binding had followed within the week. The obsidian vial containing the seal had been kept in the manor's deepest chamber, sustained by Vesperin's renewed intention every 30 days. The Eastern Court had told the vampire world that the Duke had withdrawn from court life voluntarily. A political fiction that almost as no one had questioned, because questioning Lord Vesperin Call was a significantly dangerous hobby. Celeste had understood the mechanics of the curse after 4 months of reading. She had understood how to break it after 6. The obsidian seal required a singular act of what the blood law texts called unbound intention, meaning action taken by someone outside the political structure of the court, someone who held no stake in the power dynamics, someone acting purely because it was the right thing to do. A human. A person who was, by definition, outside the court's jurisdiction entirely. Celeste had understood then why it had not been broken already. Because every vampire who knew what had been done to Hadrian was too embedded in court politics to act without political consequences. The blood laws bound them. But she was a maid. She was nobody. She was exactly the kind of person Vesperin had never thought to guard against. She had spent 2 more months making absolutely certain she was right. Because she was not the kind of woman who acted on incomplete information when the stakes involved an imprisoned vampire duke and a court chancellor who could legally have her removed from the premises and probably from the planet. Then she had gone to get the vial. That was how she had ended up in the grand ballroom at midnight on a Tuesday in her work uniform, holding a broken obsidian vial with 30 vampires staring at her and the most beautiful, most dangerous man she had ever seen walking toward her through the doors of his own liberation. Hadrian stopped 3 feet from her. This close, she could see the faint tension in his jaw that spoke to 3 years of barely controlled fury. She could see the way his silver eyes were cataloguing every detail of her face with an intensity that was slightly overwhelming at close range. "You're the maid," he said. It was not an insult. It sounded more like he was recalibrating his entire understanding of the situation. "I am," she confirmed. You broke the call sentence. I did. Using the theoretical framework in the 7th Archive's restricted section. She paused. You know that section? I wrote most of it, he said. She stared at him. You wrote the blood law texts I used to figure out how to break your own curse. Some decades ago, yes. Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was more like the ghost of one. I documented the theoretical weaknesses of the call binding as an academic exercise during my time on the High Council. I never imagined someone would actually use the research. You document how to break your own prison. In retrospect, he said, the irony is not lost on me. Lord Vesperin's voice cut through the moment like glass. This is a farce. Whatever this human has done is an unauthorized act of interference in a lawful court sentence. Under Blood Law Article 17, Celeste said, without looking away from Hadrian. I know the article, I read it. It prohibits interference by court members or their agents. I am neither. I am a domestic employee with a contract registered through a human staffing agency. I have no court standing, which means I am not subject to court law, which means I broke no law at all. The silence was different this time. Sharper, Hadrian's eyes finally showed something that was undeniably a smile. Small, contained, but real. You researched the legal exemption. I researched everything, she said. I like to be thorough. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something shift. Something that moved from cataloguing to something warmer and more complicated. Who sent you? Vesperin demanded. Which faction do you work for? Who is using you? Celeste finally turned to look at the High Chancellor. No one sent me. No one used me. I found out what you had done to him. I found out it was wrong. I found out I could fix it. So I fixed it. Vesperin's silver eyes were cold. You expect me to believe that a human cleaning woman with a first-class degree in historical linguistics and 7 years of independent research interest in pre-modern vampire blood codes, Celeste said evenly. Yes, I do expect you to believe that, because it is true. Hadrian stepped forward, placing himself smoothly between Celeste and Vesperin. The shift was subtle but absolute. He was not asking permission. He was simply repositioning himself according to a decision he had made, and the decision was that Celeste Winterbourne would not be in Lord Vesperin's direct line of sight if Hadrian Dragomir had anything to say about it. Chancellor, Hadrian said, and his voice had taken on a register that made the air in the room feel heavier. The binding is broken. The sentence is void. You may call a full council review if you wish. I would in fact welcome it. A full accounting of your reasons for the call sentence would be quite illuminating for the court. The implication landed exactly as intended. A full council review would expose the political circumstances of the binding. It would expose the treaty, the territorial theft, and the abuse of court authority Vesperin had committed to put Hadrian away. The High Chancellor knew it. Every vampire in the room knew it. Vesperin straightened. His face was a controlled mask. We will speak again, Duke Dragomir. I look forward to it, Hadrian said pleasantly. Vesperin left. His faction of guards and courtiers filtered out behind him, and the room became quiet in a completely different way than it had been before. The vampires who remained were Hadrian's people. Mira was among them, and Celeste watched tears. She clearly could not stop rolling down the vampire's pale cheeks as Hadrian spoke her name softly and touched her shoulder in acknowledgement. The reunion with his people was brief but meaningful. Hadrian was not a demonstrative man. He expressed what he felt in gestures more than words, in the attention he gave each person who came forward, in the steadiness of his manner that communicated safety and leadership, even in the minutes after his own liberation. Celeste had moved toward the edge of the room, giving them space. She was still holding the broken vial. She was not sure why she had not put it down. You can let go of it, Hadrian said. She looked up. He had crossed the room to her without any sound whatsoever, which was a skill she suspected she was going to need to get used to. Force of habit, she said, setting the shards carefully on a side table. I've been carrying pieces of this plan around for months. I don't quite know what to do with my hands without one. He looked at the shards, then back at her. How long have you been here? In the manor? Just over 2.5 years. You've been planning this for 2.5 years. Planning it for 2, verifying it for 6 months, executing it tonight. He was quiet for a moment. In the chandelier light, his white hair and pale skin made him look like something carved by a very talented sculptor who had been trying to capture what authority looked like if it had a face. "Why?" he asked. It was a simple question, and it deserved a simple answer. Because it was wrong. What Vesperin did to you was wrong, and the people who should have stopped it were too afraid, and I was not. You were not afraid. She considered being dishonest, decided against it. I was afraid the entire time, particularly tonight. But I was more committed than I was afraid. There is a difference. He studied her with the focus of someone reading a text in a language they had not encountered before. "Celeste Winterbourne," he said. "You know my name. I have been sealed in a room for 3 years, not unconscious. The staff rosters were read to me as a courtesy. Your name was on the most recent one." He paused. "I will admit I did not imagine this particular scenario when I heard it. That a maid would break your curse. That anyone would," he said. And the quiet weight in those 3 words told her more about the 3 years behind the iron doors than any scroll ever could. She did not say she was sorry, because she thought he might not want that. Instead she said, "You need to eat, and sleep probably. And then tomorrow you need to start dismantling Vesperin's position before he finds a workaround for what happened tonight." He blinked, just once. Then the almost smile returned. "You have a plan for that as well." "I have notes," she said, "in my room. Would you like to review them tomorrow?" He looked at her for a long moment, and the warmth that had been building quietly in his silver eyes, since he had walked through those iron doors, deepened into something she did not yet have a name for. "I would," he said, "very much." The next 3 days were a controlled storm. Hadrian moved through the manor like a man reclaiming territory he had never truly surrendered. He was methodical, precise, and utterly unintimidated by the political mess Vesperin had constructed in his absence. He called in obligations. He contacted allied families. He sent messages to the independent communities, whose territories the expansion treaty had been designed to consume, communities that sent representatives by the second evening, filling the manor's east wing with vampire dignitaries who had been waiting 3 years for news that the Duke was coming back. Celeste watched all of it from a position she found somewhat uncomfortable, because she was still technically the maid. She had gone back to her duties the morning after the ballroom confrontation, because she was practical enough to understand that her role had not formally changed, simply because she had done a remarkable thing the night before, and because the manor's linen situation did not resolve itself on its own. Mira had found her stripping beds in the guest corridor at 7 in the mornings and had stared at her with an expression of pure disbelief. "You cannot be serious," Mira said. "The linen needs doing," Celeste said. "You freed the Duke. The linen still needs doing." Mira had stared for another moment, then taken the bundle of sheets from Celeste's arms. "The Duke would like to speak with you. He sent me to find you. He did not specify that you would be doing laundry when I found you, but I suspect this will amuse him." It had, slightly. He had been standing in his study, 3 different historical documents spread across the desk, his white hair tied back, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. And when Mira had delivered Celeste to the door, with an explanation of where she had found her, one corner of his mouth had lifted briefly before he controlled it. He had gestured to the chair across from his own. "Sit." She had. She had also pulled the folded notes from the pocket of her uniform because she was always prepared. They had spent 4 hours in that study. It was one of the stranger afternoons of her life, and she had done some genuinely strange things in the past 2.5 years. She laid out everything she had documented about Vesperin's manipulation of court records, his illegal renewal of the binding without full council authorization, the way he had falsified the Duke's public withdrawal from court affairs. Hadrian listened to all of it without interruption. Occasionally he asked a precise, targeted question that revealed just how quickly he processed information. Occasionally he rose from his chair and paced, not from agitation but from the kind of thinking in motion energy that belonged to people whose minds moved faster than their bodies comfortably contained. At some point she stopped being aware of the dynamics of the room and simply fell into the work, the way she always did when a problem was interesting enough to absorb her completely. She talked, he questioned, she clarified. They built a strategy together that felt like watching a bridge appear from materials that had been scattered randomly, each piece suddenly obvious in its placement once you found the right angle. When they finished, the winter sun had set, and the study was lit only by the desk lamp and the amber glow from the fireplace. "This is extraordinary work," Hadrian said, and he said it the way someone states a fact. No inflation, no performing of a compliment. Just honesty. "Thank you," she said, and meant it the same way. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the spread of documents. "I want to understand something. You arrived here 8 months after my binding. You began researching the blood laws within your first weeks here. Why? Most people in your position would have simply kept their heads down and collected their pay." She thought about how to answer that. "I found the archive by accident. But once I opened the first scroll, it was not really about strategy or planning. It was just that I could not unknow what I had read. I could not read your name in a sentencing record, read what Vesperin had done and why he had done it, and simply file it away and go back to the linens." He was quiet for a moment. "A simpler person would have." "I have never been a particularly simple person," she said. "It has been an inconvenience on more than one occasion." He smiled. This time it was full and genuine, and it transformed his face in a way that she felt in the vicinity of her sternum and chose not to examine too closely. "I owe you a debt," he said, "a significant one. I need you to understand that I intend to honor it. You do not owe me a debt, I told you. I did it because it was right. That does not change what I owe." He held her gaze steadily. "In the world I inhabit, debts of this magnitude carry weight regardless of the intention of the person who incurred them. You saved my liberty, possibly my life. The call binding, sustained for a sufficient duration, can become permanent. I had perhaps another year before the window for reversal closed." She had known this from the texts. She had simply not mentioned it because it felt like unnecessary emotional pressure. "Then I am glad I moved when I did," she said. "As am I." He paused. "You should also know that staying here is no longer safe for you in the capacity you currently occupy. Vesperin will be looking for leverage. A human woman with no court standing and no formal protection who knows as much as you do is exactly the kind of leverage he would find useful." She had thought about this. She had actually been thinking it since approximately 30 seconds after she had broken the vial, when she had registered the expression on Vesperin's face and understood clearly that she had made an enemy of a very old, very powerful vampire who was now cornered and looking for moves. "I know," she said. "I would like to offer you formal court protection under the Dragomir name," he said. "Not as a servant, as a recognized associate of this house. Under blood law, that designation carries legal standing in any court proceeding and places you under the formal protection of my line." She looked at him. "That is a significant offer." "It is a significant situation," he replied. "I would like to read the specific blood law articles that define the associate designation before I agree to anything," she said. He stared at her, then he laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of him, and it was the most unguarded thing she had seen him do. It made him look slightly younger and much warmer. "Of course you would," he said. "I will have Mira pull the relevant texts." She had read them, every clause. She had come back the following morning with 3 clarifying questions and a small list of conditions, not demands, conditions, presented with the calm precision of someone who had spent years ensuring they understood every agreement they entered into. Hadrian had answered every question without impatience or condescension, which was more than she could say for most people she had negotiated with in her life. She had agreed. The formal designation was recorded in court documents that same day, and by the afternoon, the news had moved through the manor's networks with the speed that all significant information traveled in the vampire world, which was very fast indeed. Vesperin's response came on the 5th day. It came in the form of a summons. Not to Hadrian. To Celeste. The Eastern Court's full council was convening an emergency review of the binding's dissolution. Under the procedural rules of the review, any individual whose actions were under scrutiny could be required to appear and provide testimony. Celeste's actions, the summons made clear, were under scrutiny. She read the document twice. Then she went to find Hadrian. He was already coming to find her. They met in the corridor outside the library, and the expression on his face when he saw the summons in her hand told her he had already been informed. "No," he said. "Hadrian." You will not appear before that council without full legal protections in place that Vesperin's panel cannot override. I was planning to say that I think I should appear, she said, because refusing to appear looks like guilt, and I have done nothing that falls under any legitimate court jurisdiction, which means the best position is to go and say exactly that, while making sure there is a record of everything that gets said in that room. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him recalibrating. You want to create the record. I want everything Vesperin says in that room documented. Because if he overreaches, which he will, because he is cornered, and overreaching is what cornered powerful men do, then the documentation becomes the basis for the formal complaint that removes him from the chancellorship. He looked at her with that focused, cataloguing attention. You have thought about this. Since approximately 2 hours after I read the summons. The council review is tomorrow morning, I know. Do you have an advocate who can be present with me? Not to speak for me, but to ensure the procedural rules are followed correctly. I know what the rules are, but having someone in the room who has standing to object if Vesperin breaks them is important. I will be there, he said.
You have standing to object?
As the primary party in the original sentencing, I have absolute standing to be present at any review proceeding. Vesperin cannot bar me. His jaw set in a way that she had come to recognize as controlled determination. I will also be standing next to you when you walk in. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The corridor was quiet, the amber sconces casting warm shadows, and she was aware of how close they were standing, of the solid, steady presence he projected even in stillness. You do not need to protect me, she said. I am aware, he replied. I am choosing to. The distinction, delivered in that calm, certain voice, landed somewhere it was not supposed to land and stayed there. The council review took place in the Eastern Court's formal hearing chamber. We 2 levels below the ballroom. The room was circular, lined with carved stone and lit by blue-white lights that had been installed alongside the original centuries-old torch brackets. Modernity and antiquity coexisting the way they always did in vampire spaces. The reviewing panel of 7 senior court members sat in a raised arc facing the central floor. Lord Vesperin sat to one side, flanked by his own advocates. Celeste walked in beside Hadrian, and she felt the room's attention land on her like a physical weight. She kept her posture straight, her expression clear, and her hands loose at her sides. She had dressed carefully this morning, not in her uniform, because she was here as a court associate, not a servant, but in her own clothes. Dark trousers, a deep blue blouse, her hair properly pinned, small decisions, but they mattered. The presiding council member, a very old vampire named Seraphiel Voss, whose silver eyes held the peculiar quality of absolute patience, opened the proceedings with the standard recitation of purpose. His voice was like stone smoothed by centuries of use. Vesperin's case, presented through his advocate, was precisely what Celeste had expected. It argued that while her specific act of breaking the seal might fall outside court jurisdiction, the planning and preparation constituted a conspiracy that fell under the court's broader authority to police actions that affected the functioning of its political structure. It was a creative argument. It was also wrong. Celeste waited until Vesperin's advocate had finished speaking, and then she addressed the panel directly, without an advocate of her own, because she was capable of speaking for herself, and she wanted the record to show that. She presented her position clearly. She cited the specific articles. She walked through the logic, step by step, with the precision of someone who had been building this argument in her head 2.5 years, without knowing she would one day have to deliver it in a stone chamber, surrounded by immortals who could probably snap her in half without exerting themselves. Her voice did not shake once. Seraphiel Voss listened to all of it with that ancient patience. Then he asked 2 questions, both of which Celeste answered without hesitations. Then Hadrian spoke. He did not speak long. He did not need to. When Hadrian Dragomir addressed the panel, the room's atmosphere shifted in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to miss. He was 3 years out of formal court engagement, and he was still, unmistakably, the most powerful presence in the room. He laid out the context of the original binding with measured, devastating precision. The treaty, the refusal, the call sentence invoked without full council authorization. The falsification of his public withdrawal. Vesperin's advocate objected 4 times. Hadrian continued speaking as though the objections were slightly interesting weather phenomena and nothing more. By the time he was done, two of the 7 panel members were looking at Vesperin with expressions that contained a remarkable amount of quiet fury. The panel retired to deliberate. Celeste and Hadrian stood in the stone corridor outside the chamber, and she leaned against the wall and let out a slow breath. "You are the most composed person I have ever met," Hadrian said. He was standing beside her close enough that she was aware of the precise distance between them. "I was not composed. I was performing composure," she said. "There is a critical difference, and one I intend to continue exploiting. How long did it take you to learn to perform it that convincingly?" She thought about it. "Most of my life. I grew up in a house where showing fear or uncertainty was treated as weakness. Eventually, you build walls strong enough that the performance becomes easier than the alternative." He was quiet for a moment. "That is not a simple history. It is not a simple topic, but it is not a sad story either. The walls have served me well." He looked at her sideways. She looked back at him. They were standing very close, and the stone corridor was very quiet, and she was abruptly aware of the particular quality of attention he was giving her, which was the kind of attention that contained something beyond analysis. "Celeste," he said. "Hadrian, when this is resolved," he began. The chamber doors opened. Seraphil Voss stood in the frame. "The panel is ready to return its findings," he said. The findings were unambiguous. Celeste's actions fell entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Eastern Court. Lord Vesperin Call's original invocation of the call sentence was found to have been procedurally irregular in 3 specific areas, all of which were now formally on the record. A full investigation into the circumstances of the Duke's binding was ordered to begin within 30 days. Vesperin sat very still throughout the reading. His face was controlled, but his hands, Celeste noticed, had closed into fists. He was not finished yet. She knew that with absolute certainty. Cornered, powerful men did not simply accept the closing of their options. They looked for the one play they had left. She found out what that play was at 9 o'clock that evening. She was in her room, which she still thought of as her room, despite the associate designation, because she was pragmatic about the fact that symbolic elevation did not change where one slept. She had been reviewing her notes on the investigation timeline when her door opened without a knock. She looked up. 2 vampires she did not recognize stood in the doorway. They were not dressed in Dragomir colors. They were not staff. They were large and very still in the way that vampires trained for a specific purpose became still. "Lord Vesperin would like to speak with you," one said. She looked at them calmly. Her heart was moving at a notably elevated pace. "The Lord Chancellor has my contact information on record through the court office. He is welcome to submit a formal communication." "He would prefer this to be informal," the vampire said, and stepped into the room. Celeste was already moving. She had thought about this scenario. She had a clear path to the door that was not the door they had come through. A connecting door to the linen corridor she had used as a staff member for 2.5 years, and knew the layout of better than almost anyone in the building. She made it into the corridor. She heard them behind her, close, moving with that unnerving supernatural speed, and she ran, flat out, down the linen corridor, through the service stairs, yelling for Mira as she went, because Mira's room was 1 floor below, and Mira was a vampire, and Celeste was decidedly not. She made it to the landing of the 4th floor before a hand caught her arm and she spun, breath gone, completely out of options. But it was not Vesperin's man, it was Hadrian. He had come from the main staircase. Moving so fast, he had outpaced Vesperin's vampires entirely, and he was holding her arm with one hand and looking at her with eyes that were no longer the calm silver she was used to, but something brighter and more dangerous. The 2 vampires appeared at the top of the service stairs. They saw Hadrian. They stopped. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Go back to your employer," Hadrian said, "and tell him that if he attempts to use Celeste Winterbourne as leverage again in any form, I will stop being interested in managing this through court proceedings." They went. He turned back to her. She was breathing hard. His hand was still on her arm. "How did you know?" she asked. "Myra saw them enter the residential corridor. She came to me immediately." His jaw was tight. "Are you hurt?" "No. I got out quickly. You knew to run. I told you. I planned for contingencies." She looked at him. Vesperin is going to keep trying. Yes, he agreed. We need to accelerate the formal complaint. The 30-day investigation timeline is too long. We need to push for an emergency motion to suspend his chancellorship pending the investigation, and we need to file it tomorrow morning before he has time to organize another approach. He looked at her for a long moment. His hand was still on her arm, very warm and very steady, and she was looking up at him in the dim stairwell light, and something between them had shifted. She was not sure precisely when, but the shift was undeniable now, in a way it had not quite been before. "Celeste," he said, and his voice was different. Lower. More careful, yes. When I came through those doors in the ballroom and saw you standing there with the broken vial, I thought you were the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen, he said. I have seen many things across a very long life. I want to be clear about that context. Her breath, which had almost recovered from the running, did something entirely new. And tonight, he continued, when Mira came to me and told me where you were, I moved faster than I have moved in 3 years. He paused. I need you to understand that my interest in your safety is not purely a matter of obligation. I see, she said carefully. I am trying to communicate something, he said, with the slight tension of someone who did not communicate this kind of thing often, and was feeling the unfamiliarity of it. I know what you're communicating, she said. I am just deciding how honest to be in return. I would prefer honest, he said. She looked at him, this white-haired, silver-eyed, ancient, beautiful, deeply honorable man who had been imprisoned for 3 years because he had refused to betray people who depended on him, and she said, I have spent 2.5 years thinking about you as a problem to solve. Somewhere in the past 5 days, I stopped being able to think about you as only that. He looked at her. Good, he said, very quietly. She laughed, a short, slightly unsteady sound. Good, good, he repeated, and the warmth in his silver eyes was full and open and entirely unconcerned with whether it was appropriate. She was standing close enough that she could have stepped forward and closed the remaining distance without any effort at all. She did. She was not sure which of them moved first. She thought perhaps it was both of them at once which felt right. His hand, the one on her arm, shifted to her waist, and he kissed her with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided to do something and did not do things halfway. It was warm and slow and careful in a way that somehow contained everything he was. The steadiness and the heat and the enormous focused attention he brought to every single thing he turned himself toward. When they separated, she was very still. Right, she said eventually. Yes, he agreed. She cleared her throat. The emergency motion still needs to be filed tomorrow morning. He smiled, properly, fully. It was devastating. Of course it does. And someone should probably check that those two are actually gone and not loitering in the service corridor. Mira is handling that as we speak. Good, she paused. Then perhaps we could go back to your study, and I could show you the specific articles that support the emergency suspension motion. I would like nothing more, he said, and offered her his arm, and she took it. And they walked back up the stairs together in the quiet amber light of the manor that had been her home for 2.5 years. And everything felt different, and also exactly right. The emergency motion was filed at 8 the following morning. Vesperin's response was swift and, Celeste thought, slightly desperate. He attempted to invoke an obscure procedural rule that would have required the motion to be heard by a panel that he himself had appointed. Hadrian's legal team, assembled overnight from the most accomplished blood law scholars among his allied families, dismantled the argument in approximately 40 minutes and filed a counter-motion citing the obvious conflict of interest. The court system was moving faster than Vesperin had anticipated. He had built his position on the assumption of slow, controllable processes. He had not built it to withstand a duke who had spent 3 years in a sealed room, thinking very carefully about everything he would do when he got out. So supported by a woman who had spent 2.5 years building the case that would make all of it possible, the suspension of Vesperin Call's chancellorship was granted on the 8th day. It was a provisional suspension, pending the full investigation, but provisional was more than enough. Without the chancellorship, he lost his ability to invoke court authority. Without court authority, the moves he had been making became legally indefensible, and the allies who had supported him because it was safe to do so began, with the quiet pragmatism of people whose first loyalty was always to their own interests, to recalibrate. Celeste heard about the suspension from Mira, who knocked on the study door where Celeste had been working and delivered the news with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. Celeste put down her pen, sat with the news for approximately 3 seconds, and then felt the long-sustained tension of the past months release from her shoulders in a single slow exhale. She had not quite realized how much she had been holding until she let it go. Hadrian came to find her an hour later. He had been in meetings since dawn, and he looked, for the first time since his liberation, tired in a way that he was allowing to show. She thought that was probably meaningful, that he was showing it to her specifically. He sat across from her at the study table. She poured him tea from the pot she had made, because she still did practical things automatically, and he took it without comment and drank it, and they sat together in the quiet morning study, and it felt like the exhale she had taken an hour ago, but warmer and more permanent. "It is not finished," he said after a while. "No," she agreed. "The investigation will take months, and Vesperin's allies will look for opportunities, and yet, she agreed. The shape of it is different now. We have the record, we have the motion, we have the document trail and the council proceedings. The legal structure is on our side, in a way it was not 8 days ago." He looked at her across the table. "You did this. We did this," she corrected. "The architecture of it was yours. The research, the legal framework, the strategy." He paused, the courage to walk into that ballroom alone. "I was not entirely alone," she said. "The texts you wrote were with me, in a sense." Something crossed his face. "You used the academic work I produced 400 years ago to dismantle the prison my own court put me in." "History has a sense of irony," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I would like you to stay." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that complete steady directness that she had come to understand was simply how he was, no performance, no ornament, just the thing itself. "In the manor?" she asked. "Yes, but beyond that." He set down the tea. "I am rebuilding. The court, the alliances, the network that Vesperin damaged. It will take time and it will require people I trust completely around me. You are the person I trust most completely. That is not a small thing to say. I do not say things like that without meaning them precisely." "I know," she said. "And beyond the practical," he continued, with the slight careful quality of a man entering territory he takes seriously, "I want you here because I want you here. Specifically, because in 5 days you have become someone I do not wish to imagine proceeding without." She looked at the table, then at him. She thought about the past 2.5 years, the archive at night, the scrolls, the careful, patient work of building something from nothing in a place where she was invisible. And she thought about how she had never imagined, not once, that it would end with this, with someone looking at her like that. "I have nowhere else I particularly want to be," she said honestly. He reached across the table and took her hand slowly, giving her complete latitude to withdraw, and she did not withdraw. His hand was cool and steady and certain. "Good," he said. She smiled. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being accurate," he replied. The investigation of Lord Vesperin Call took 4 months and 3 weeks. During that time, Celeste was appointed formally as chief archivist and legal consultant to the House of Dragomir, a title that Hadrian had invented specifically for her because no existing title quite covered what she did, which was essentially everything related to the documentary and legal underpinning of the court's reconstruction. She did not mind the invented title. She minded, considerably less than she might have expected, many things about her new life. She learned the manor properly, all of it. The upper floors she had cleaned for 2.5 years, and the lower floors she had only read about. The archive became truly hers in a way it had only been hers by stealth before. Mira became a genuine friend, which was a thing she had not had in some time, and found she had missed more than she had acknowledged. She learned Hadrian. It was not a simple or quick process. He was not a simple man, and the layers of him came in their own order and on their own timeline. What she found, under the authority and the precision and the controlled exterior that had been formed over a very long time, was a person of extraordinary depth. He was genuinely funny, in the dry, understated way that she suspected very few people ever got close enough to notice. He was deeply loyal to a degree that was almost frightening. The kind of loyalty that had kept him from signing the treaty even when the consequence was his own imprisonment. He had opinions about history that he would defend with a fervor that slightly surprised her the first time she encountered it, and she had found herself in a 2-hour disagreement with him about the interpretation of an event from 6 centuries ago that ended with both of them laughing and neither of them conceding. He, in turn, was learning her. He learned her work habits, which were slightly chaotic in appearance and rigidly organized in actual structure. He learned that she thought best when she was moving, and that she had a particular relationship with tea, which she consumed in large quantities and with strong opinions about preparation. He learned that she was not afraid of difficult conversations, but that she sometimes needed to prepare for them in her own way before she had them. He learned that she was, beneath the composure and the competence and the incredible stubbornness, a person who had spent a lot of her life not being seen, and that being seen by him mattered to her in a way that she expressed not in words, but in the small relaxation of her guard at specific moments. He paid attention to the specific moments. He paid attention in general. It was one of the things about him that she found consistently overwhelming, the sheer quality of his attention when it was directed at her. Vampires, she had come to understand, had a capacity for focus that humans simply did not possess in the same way. When Hadrian Dragomir focused on her, she felt it like a physical thing, like warm light on her face. She told him this one evening in the library, when they were sitting on opposite ends of the same long sofa, reading different books, and she had looked up and found him watching her with that full, undivided focus. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "No," she said. "That is rather the point." He set his book down and looked at her fully. "Celeste, I want to say something." She closed her own book. "Then say it." "I have existed for a very long time," he said. "I want you to understand that statement correctly, not as a boast. As context. In that time, I have been involved in matters of enormous political and historical significance. I have seen things that changed the shape of the world. I have known people who became legends." He paused. "Nothing in that span of time has impressed me as much as you. Not as a statement of romantic flattery, as a literal fact about my experience." She looked at him. Her chest was doing something she was becoming familiar with in his company. "Hadrian," she said. "I am not finished," he said. "Sorry. Go ahead." "I am also," he said more quietly, "completely certain that I am in love with you." I have been building to this sentence for some weeks, and I am now saying it because I have decided that continuing not to say it is less efficient than saying it. She stared at him. Then she laughed, startled and genuine. "That is the most practical declaration of love I have ever received. I am a practical man, I know." She looked at him, this beautiful, ancient, impossibly earnest person. "I am also completely certain that I am in love with you. I have been aware of this for approximately 6 weeks and have been choosing the right moment to say so." "This is the right moment," he said. "I think so too," she agreed. He crossed the library in the way he moved when he had decided to do something, unhurried and completely inevitable, and she put her book on the side table, and he sat beside her and kissed her in the warm library lamplight, and it was different from the stairwell, which had been urgent and half surprised. This was deliberate, this was chosen. This was 2 people with full information making a decision they intended to keep. Vesperin's formal hearing came on the day Celeste counted as their anniversary, which was a coincidence she privately found very satisfying. The council chamber was full. This was not an emergency panel review. This was a full court proceeding, with all council members present and the public gallery of lesser vampire houses permitted to observe. The evidence was vast and meticulously documented, much of it from Celeste's 2.5 years of archive research, much of it from the preceding essays over the past months. Hadrian's legal team presented it with surgical precision. Vesperin's defense was well constructed. He was, Celeste had always acknowledged, very intelligent. He had answers for most of the procedural irregularities, though those answers were somewhat strained. What he did not have answers for was the treaty. The evidence that the call sentence had been invoked not for any legal transgression, but to force compliance with a political agenda that would have benefited Vesperin's allied families enormously. That evidence, assembled across months from documents that Vesperin had assumed were either destroyed or irrelevant, was irrefutable. Seraphiel Voss presided. He asked questions for 3 hours. He was the most thorough questioner Celeste had ever witnessed. At 5 in the afternoon, the council returned its findings. Lord Vesperin Calls was found to have abused the powers of the chancellorship in invoking the call sentence without proper authorization and for politically motivated, rather than legally sound reasons. The chancellorship was formally stripped. The associated lands and privileges were subject to legal review. Criminal charges under blood law for unlawful imprisonment and falsification of court records were filed. It was over. Celeste sat in the gallery and absorbed the reading of the findings with the stillness she had learned to maintain in rooms full of vampires. Beside her, Mira was very carefully not crying, which she could see required significant effort. Hadrian was on the council floor, as was his right as the primary affected party, and she could see his profile, the set of his jaw, the controlled stillness. After the council dismissed and the chamber began to empty, he came to her. He offered her his hand without speaking. She took it. They walked out of the chamber together and up through the levels of the manor, past the archive that had started all of this, past the ballroom where it had come to a head, and out onto the broad stone terrace that overlooked the city of Ashford below. It was early evening, and the city lights were coming on, amber and white, and scattered like a second sky below the one above them. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. He was standing behind her, close, one hand on her waist, looking out at the same city she was looking at. She could feel the solid warmth of him at her back, which was strange because vampires ran cool, but he had always, she had noticed, run warmer in her presence, as though her proximity changed something about his body's natural state. She had read enough to know that was not nothing. For an old vampire of his bloodline, that kind of physiological response had a name in the blood law texts. She had not mentioned it to him yet, because she was still deciding how to have that conversation. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered her options. "I am thinking," she said, "that I read a passage in the 7th archive about 4 months ago that described a particular physiological response that old vampires of significant bloodline experience in the sustained presence of a specific individual." She felt him go very still. "Did you?" "I did." The text referred to it as the anchor response. Apparently it was considered quite significant, historically speaking, associated with rare cases of genuine bond formation. She paused. "I ran the thermal readings because I am thorough." He turned her gently so she was facing him. His silver eyes were very close and very full. "And?" he said. "The readings are consistent with the texts," she said. "For what that is worth." "It is worth a considerable amount," he said, his voice low. "I thought you might feel that way." "Celeste." He held her face in both hands, gentle and sure, his cool fingers against her warm skin. "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to take as much time as you need to answer it." She looked at him. "Ask." "I would like you to stay with me, not as an employee, not as a court associate, not as someone I have made a strategic alliance with, though I value all of those things." He looked at her steadily. "I would like you to stay with me because I love you, and because you are the most extraordinary person I have ever known, and because the thought of this manor, of my life, of any of it, without you in it, is something I find genuinely unbearable." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a significant statement," she said. "I know. You are a vampire duke, an immortal. I am a human woman with a historical linguistics degree and very good research skills." Yes, those are accurate facts. The duration question is one that would need to be navigated carefully and with full information. I would need to understand all the options and their implications. I am not going to make that choice quickly. "I do not want you to make it quickly," he said immediately. "I want you to make it with complete information and full certainty, and I am prepared to wait exactly as long as that takes. Whatever you choose, I will support." She looked at him. She thought about the two and a half years of this place. The archive at midnight, the slow, patient building of a case for a man she had only known through court documents, the ballroom, the study, the stairwell, the library, the past 5 months of learning him and being learned in return, of two people with very different histories, finding that those histories fit together in a way that felt more like recognition than coincidence. She thought about the anchor response and its implications, which she had been quietly researching for 4 months, and which she understood well enough to know that her own physiological responses, though different in mechanism from his, told a consistent story. "I am staying," she said. "That is not a statement that requires more time. I am staying." She paused. "The longer question we will address together, carefully, with full information, but the fundamental answer is yes." His exhale was almost inaudible, but she was close enough to hear it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she confirmed. He kissed her on the stone terrace above the city, with the amber light of Ashford below them, and the cold, clear sky above, and she put her hands against his chest and felt the slow, steady rhythm beneath her palms, ancient and patient, and she thought, "This is what it feels like to be exactly where you are supposed to be." The spring that followed was the first spring in 3 years that Dragomir Manor opened its formal reception season. It was a considerable event in the vampire political world. Hadrian's return to full court function, after everything that had happened, carried symbolic weight that resonated across the Eastern Territories and beyond. Celeste managed approximately half of the logistics, which she had not planned to do, but which had fallen to her, naturally, because she was good at it, and because the Manor's existing event staff were lovely but somewhat organizationally overwhelmed. She worked alongside Mira and a rotating cast of very polite, very ancient vampires who were visiting dignitaries from allied houses, and she found she was not remotely intimidated by any of them, which she suspected was partly her own temperament and partly the fact that she had broken a duke's curse in a ballroom and survived a court hearing and helped dismantle a chancellor's power base. And after all of that, seating arrangements felt relatively manageable. Hadrian watched her navigate his world with a quality of expression that she had learned to recognize as specifically reserved. For her, Mira called it the look. It was not a discreet expression. He did not appear to be attempting to make it discreet. She did not mind. The formal reception took place on a night in late April, when the air still held enough cold to make the manor's heated halls particularly welcoming. 200 guests, every allied house represented. The political landscape had shifted significantly since Vesperin's removal, and the shifting had been, on the whole, favorable. The territories that had been under threat from the expansion treaty were secured. 3 of Vesperin's former allies had negotiated new agreements with the Dragomir house that were mutually beneficial and legally sound. The Eastern Court had a new interim chancellor, an elderly vampire named Aldrich Sova, who had served under 3 previous dukes, and whose primary qualities were thoroughness and a complete lack of political ambition. It was, Celeste thought, watching the reception from a balcony overlooking the main hall, a genuinely good outcome. Not a perfect one, because perfect outcomes were a category she did not believe in, but a good one. Better than the situation had been 8 days after the curse broke, better than she had dared project in her most optimistic planning scenarios. Hadrian appeared beside her. He had been working the room below for an hour, as was required of him, and he moved with the ease of someone who had been navigating these particular social dynamics for longer than the country she had grown up in had existed. He was wearing a dark coat with silver detail at the collar that made him look, she thought, extraordinarily beautiful, which was information she was going to deliver to him later when there were fewer people within earshot. "The reception is going well," she said. "The reception is going exactly as planned," he said. "Which is your doing more than mine. I did the logistics. You did the politics." "We did both," he said, which was accurate. He stood beside her and looked out at the hall below, the white and silver of old vampire families, the controlled grace of beings who had existed for centuries. She thought she would never entirely stop finding it remarkable. This world she had walked into accidentally and chosen to stay in deliberately. "Lord Aldrich asked me about you this evening," Hadrian said. "What did he ask?" "He asked whether the reports were accurate, whether you had truly done what everyone said you had done." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that the reports were significant understatements." He looked at her sidelong. He then said that in his 400 years of services to various dukes, he had never seen the duke look at anyone the way I look at you. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "And what did you say to that?" she asked. "I told him that in my considerably longer time I had never had anyone worth looking at in that particular way," he said. and that I intended to continue doing so for the foreseeable future. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that she did not always manage to contain, the full, undefended one that she had spent most of her life keeping to herself and had been, in recent months, progressively less able to suppress around him. 400 years of service, she repeated. He's seen a great deal. He has, and he's never seen the Duke look at anyone that way, apparently not. She looked at him, this beautiful, ancient, deeply honorable man who had chosen her with the same thoroughness he brought to every choice he made. Then I suppose I should take that as a positive indicator. I would suggest, he said, with that dry, warm humor she had come to love specifically, that it is a highly positive indicator. She turned back to the hall below. He stood beside her, close and solid and completely certain, the way he always was, the way she had come to think of as intrinsic to him, as much a part of who he was as the silver eyes and the ancient bloodline and the extraordinary stubborn capacity for doing the right thing, even when the cost was enormous. She had broken a curse to free him. It had started as principle and research and a stubborn refusal to let something wrong go uncorrected. But somewhere in the archive at midnight, in the careful turning of centuries-old pages, she had made a promise she had not known she was making, to this person she had not yet met, to the cause of his freedom, to the idea that what had been done to him was wrong, and that the world worked better when wrong things got corrected. She had kept that promise, and what she had not anticipated, what no amount of research and careful planning could have prepared her for, was that the person she freed would be the person she chose. That was perhaps the part that still surprised her most. Not the vampires, not the blood laws, not the court politics or the curse mechanics, or any of the extraordinary things she had walked into. Those she had learned and handled and navigated. What surprised her was this, the warmth and the certainty of it, the way a situation that had begun in principle had ended in love, which was the most human outcome possible, and which she thought, looking out at a hall full of immortals, was perhaps the most remarkable thing she had achieved in all of it. She felt his hand find hers where it rested on the balcony rail. She turned her palm and laced her fingers through his. Below, the reception continued. The politics of the vampire world shifted and settled into new shapes. Outside the manor, Ashford went about its night, ordinary and oblivious. The archive was 2 floors down, full of scrolls she still had not read all of, because there was always more to understand, and she intended to spend a considerable amount of time understanding it. And in all of that, she was here, present and specific and chosen. He looked at her, she looked at him. "Come," he said. "There are people below who should meet you properly. Not as the woman who broke the curse, though you will always be that, but as the person who stays." She smiled and stepped forward, and he walked beside her, and they descended into the amber light of the reception together. Together, 2 people from very different worlds who had found, in the most unlikely circumstances, exactly what they were looking for. The manor held them. The night held them. And the future, wide and unwritten, waited with all the patience of something that knew it had time. Celeste Winterbourne had come to Dragomir Manor as a maid, and everyone had doubted her, and she had broken a curse that the entirety of the vampire court had left standing, and she had fallen in love along the way, and she had stayed, and in the silver eyes of Hadrian Dragomir, steady and warm and absolutely certain, she saw everything she had ever wanted to be seen as, and she was not afraid at all.